here. There we go. So we went through the introductions already, and again, just a little bit of a broader background on the series overview and why we're doing this. I think Jim touched on this a little bit already, but Houston Engineering got contracted to support a project that was led by IAWA, funded by the NRCS, and the component that we did for that project was to develop PTM app data and integrate that with ACPF data, which eventually became IAPA. And so kind of as the tail end outcome of this workshop, I think the real broader vision is that we're doing some education and outreach as best as we can in today's times to make the information a little more accessible through these presentations. Jim mentioned the first time, he might recap at the end as well too, that there is a small pot of resources available after we're done presenting these webinars, if attendees would like to reach out to anyone from Houston Engineering and get a little one-on-one support with some of this data. So I might point out a few, if I remember, try to point out a few places during the presentation where maybe that would make sense for folks on the line. Just kind of orientating everyone to where we're at in the overall series. Webinar 1 was done already, as well as Webinar 2, and so we're moving into Webinar 3. Kaya will be previewing Webinar 4 shortly. I will be in the next chunk of information here, kind of recapping what was in the first 2. We'll be transitioning then for the bulk of our time into Webinar 3. And Kaya at the end will come in and preview what will be in Webinar 4 a little bit. So Webinar 1 review, and the way I'm going to very just broadly generalize Webinar 1, and then I'm going to move through this content pretty quickly, is it gave a great introduction and overview to all this data that is now available within the Middle Cedar watershed. And it began to take you through the process of understanding how you can use the data to find hotspots on the landscape from where sediment and nutrients are coming from and where they're being delivered to. And so that gets to kind of some of the bullet points on the screen here and some of those lead-in questions of getting going on your assessment with this types of data. And this is the graphic that kind of explains what IAPA is. If I was a good graphic artist, what I would do with this is make this little PTM app circle with all the text on it into a Pac-Man. I would cut a little hole here and make it look like it was eating this pyramid. Because that's kind of the idea here is the ACPF system gives you polygons on the landscape where a practice could go, and it does a very good job of doing that. However, this PTM app system we've been talking about really isn't in competition with that. What it does is it makes use of that data and attaches additional information to it to make it a richer data set. So that's why, you know, Pac-Man here, kind of an analysis system eating the other piece of data. So I am going to pause on this one just for a minute so everyone can get a look at these links. This is where if you come back later, and I'm sure IAWA or Houston Engineering would be happy to send these out to folks too if need be as follow-ups. But these just give you links to where you can get access to the background information, the tool downloads, everything else. So ACPF, you go to this first link. Anytime I use the acronym PTM app or IAPA, that information is embedded in the Bowser links down here. So I think that was likely mentioned in previous webinars. I'll hit it one more time just because of all the acronyms. IAPA is literally a button that's buried in the PTM app toolbar. So when you click that button, pointed at an ACPF database, you're attaching water quality benefits to your ACPF data. Again, here's just what the deliverables from this project look like. So if you don't have them, or if you've received them already, what you should get is a folder that's got an ACPF database contained in it, a PTM app database, and inside of the ACPF, you should see the standard polygon results, along with the enhancements that occur through running the IAPA system, attaching those water quality benefits to those ACPF conservation practices. So again, this is just hitting you guys with this a lot, so you see that, yeah, there's 2 big databases, and what we're trying to do in this process is demystify a little bit all the information that's packaged in here. In particular, the way I put it in the end of the previous webinar is it's a lot like the Surgo Soils database. There's a ton of information in here. You see all these rasters, all these shape files, all these tables. We're trying to give you some practical ways to understand how you get your polygon, find the table you want that has the information you need, connect them back together, just like you do if you're working with some of the Surgo Soils databases from NRCS that I'm sure some of our participants are familiar with. And so again, the structure, the way we've been doing this, and you'll see it again for this presentation, is we've been giving you some screen examples that show how to do the joins and how to mash the data sets together. And then we're going into a live demo inside of ArcGIS. We'll be repeating that a little bit again today. You'll be seeing some of the same types of information here, where we're showing you how to join, again, the polygon data to these tables and make sure you get the data connected that you need or that you're looking for. In the previous presentation that Rachel did, at the conclusion, what she'd shown is how to pick out your top 20 practices for nitrogen reductions at the outlet of a HUC 12 watershed, or a watershed that was used for a local water quality plan. And so what she'd done, and I'm just hitting this quickly, she'd extracted some data, like I was talking about, joined it back up with the polygons, and then went through and did a selection process to pick up the best 20. When I get into the meat of my presentation, I'm gonna kind of pick up where she went off with a targeted set of practices, and then we're just gonna build right on top of that the economics data and the bang for your buck information. And again, if anyone on the call right now, I'll just do a quick pause, sees any questions in the question box. Right now, with the way my setup is, I cannot see the chat box, so please unmute right away, interrupt me, and we'll get those addressed. This is kind of where webinar 2 ended, and I've rapidly went through our overview. And what we ended with was a product that basically could be a solution to the idea of targeting where conservation could go based upon the largest load reductions in nitrogen. So with that, again, I went through that really rapidly just so we didn't chew up too much time recapping. I am going to stop sharing my screen one more time and just pause for a couple of seconds and see, does anyone have any follow-up questions, conversations that they want to have about the information from the previous webinars?
Just have one quick comment that people don't have the databases, just reach out and contact me and I'll get that posted. The files are rather large, but we'll get those posted for you. I know Mary Beth has them, but I don't think too many others on the call have them yet.
Perfect. And anything's fair game. You can try to tell me to recreate something on the fly and I'll give it a go. So I'll pause just one more moment in case anyone has a question. Otherwise, we'll keep moving.
This is James. I got a question.
Yep.
It's just kind of about the process. You know, you run the ACPF and then you have the toolbar that does the PTM app. Is that just a button and you click it and it does its thing? And then how many hours or time does it take above and beyond the ACPF to get at the final deliverables?
Great question. So the way the system works, first you need your ACPF data. You're spot on that. And then what the IAPA does is it needs the underlying architecture from PTM app to run. So your step 2 is running PTM app through. So you have that foundation too. And then you're spot on. There's one button and a drop down and it says ingest ACPF. You click that button, you point it towards your ACPF database and hit go, and it runs the process for you. And there's a few things in there you can select and modify to fit the way you want to do business, but in general, that's it. So the bulk of the work is computer processing time. Once you get the underlying input set up, 95% of it is computer processing time. For a big watershed like the whole Middle Cedar, you're probably looking on weeks of processing time because it's a huge area, right? But if you guys were to pick this up and refine it for a HUC 12, given that you already have all those inputs there, I think you'd be done in less than a week. It's just because of all those raster grids, it's an exponential increase in time as you make those watersheds bigger. So what we've seen when people use this is a lot of the time there's that big upfront investment in the initial big watershed development, but then people start chunking it out and working on smaller areas because they can process it pretty rapidly.
But just to kind of highlight that you can do quite a bit without further PTM app processing, just going directly into the databases like Rachel was doing last week.
So that's a great point, Jim, and a good segue. What I just gave as an answer might have, shied people away a little bit from future work with the data, but all of the products we are showing you here today can be built rather quickly on top of the existing data structure that's already been processed. And all the products that have been showed in previous webinars as well. Any other comments or questions before we move into the new content? All right, I'm going to boot up my screen again and keep moving with the presentation. Give me about 20 seconds here. All right, and James, I still got your video on. Can you give me a thumbs up if you see it? Perfect, thank you, sir. All right, so this is kind of an overview of the new content we're going to be going through today. It's really three main parts, although I'll have different products inside of there as we go through. The first one is really giving you some background on how we did the economic calculations or the cost calculations. And the simple way of looking at that is, you know, you got all these polygons in your GIS. How did we actually attach a cost to that information? So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about that. Then after that, we're going to go into using economic selection criteria to select conservation practices. That's where we're going to get into kind of the demo of what a map product could look like, a simple overview of the instructions to make it, and then I'll break off and go into actual live demonstration in ArcGIS and show you how to compose that with the existing data sets, just like had been done in the previous webinars. And then as we go through, I'll also be touching a little bit on some of the post-processing modifications that could continue to be done to this data over time, depending upon maybe some local information you have on different cost estimation techniques. And that'll be a little more apparent as we get into things here. So this table is a little brutal to put up in a virtual-based webinar because it's way too much messy information, right? But it's an important underpinning to the rest of the webinar, and making sure everyone understands what they get when they receive this data, or if they see the cost numbers that come out of it. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time going over this, and I probably will pause after I'm done to see if anyone needs any clarification, because it's a lot of information on the slide. So the basis of the cost estimation techniques we used for this project was a life cycle cost assessment. And so what that means, when you see dollars attached to a practice, that is built upon largely research that was done at Iowa State that looks at the cost of that practice over its full life cycle. And you're seeing some of the breakdowns for the different types of ACPF practices here: 20-year, 15-year, 20-year, 30-year, 1 year. And then you have the unit cost. We broke that down into to apply it to the individual practices at this very large scale. The reason this is important to kind of focus on for a minute, inclusive in those assumptions, are things like ongoing maintenance over the course of those 20 to 30 years, and you know, all the other factors in addition to that initial upfront implementation cost. So one of the things I'd encourage you guys to think about when and if you begin using this data is that reflective of how you want to estimate the cost for what you're doing. The reason I say it that way is we have certainly worked with groups where when they do a small watershed plan, they're not necessarily looking for that life cycle cost. I think it's very informative to broader discussions when you're looking at policies and procedures to reach, you know, big picture goals. But if you break it down to a small watershed and you're developing like an annual implementation work plan for like a grant, your cost might be driven more by how much you're going to cost share out on a given project in that year or the 2 to 3 years of your program. So in those instances, some of these life cycle costs might not match up perfectly with how you do business locally. I think it's still very valuable from a planning perspective. And the nice thing as we get into things here, I'll point out that they're very easy to tweak on your own end. So it's not a big deal if when you get to using this data, you need to adjust those a little bit. But I did want to point that out before we get too much further. And I'm not going to stop sharing this time, but does anyone have a quick question they'd like to ask about it? If anything wasn't clear there, I'd be happy to spend a little more time on it. All right. If there was a chat message window, please interrupt me and call out what that was. But otherwise, I'll keep moving. And so this is the way I've generally laid out the remainder of the presentation. the first thing I'm going to do is show you the map product, the deliverable, so to speak, of an assessment. After that, I'm going to just do an overview of the steps. And after I've done that, I'm going to go into a live demonstration of how to build this. Similar to other webinars, well, we've teed up these products for the pictures on the slides for both of the 2 Huck 12 watersheds where there's local plans created. The demonstrations, just so it's cleaner and easier, that I'm going to do are going to be for this Headwaters watershed. And what I'm showing on the map is an estimation of how cost effective these different practices would be. In particular, what's being shown, the dark purple here, so low in this instance, is actually better, because what it's saying is for every dollar you invest in these practices, you get a greater return in terms of your nitrogen reduction at the outlet of that watershed, not just at the practice, so at the outlet. So in this map, the darker purples, the simple way of saying this is, would give you the best bang for your buck in terms of the nitrogen reduction at the outlet. The other thing that's built into here that I'll show you a little bit when I get into the live demonstration, this is not for all the practices that we had inside of ACPF. This is building on top of targeted practices that we've already pruned out that have large potential for load reduction. So that's an important qualifier as we move into this bang for your buck assessment. Bang for your buck is one criteria, and I think it's very useful in informing how we do this work. But another thing to think about, just from the previous webinar, is that it also gives you a large enough load reduction benefit that it is worth implementing. Because it certainly is possible to have a small load reduction benefit with a very small cost that'll say, oh, that's a great bang for your buck. But the data might not be suggesting that you're doing enough for the resource for it to make a difference. The other thing I've done, and you'll see this throughout today's presentation, given that we're at the tail end of the kind of bigger watershed mapping data that we're going to be sharing in these webinars, I'm starting to integrate some of the information from the different webinars we've done. And so what you see in the various transparent shades of green is a source assessment map. So I'm layering here several pieces of information so that it could be used to inform decisions from the multiple webinars we've done. So this source assessment map, the dark green areas are showing you the higher contributions of nitrogen to the outlet point of the watershed. Whereas we've also incorporated the targeting for load reduction, right? I told you we pruned out some of the practices with the largest load reduction. So we got that factor. That's webinar 2. And now webinar 3, we're also showing of those that are potentially on top of a high sourcing area and give you a good load reduction benefit, where are you going to get the most bang for your buck? So you're seeing kind of multiple layers of information stacked together. And this is just giving you an example of some of the data you could pull in to build these. I'm going to give you one clarification point as we look at this real quick. I'm highlighting here the nutrient reduction wetlands. In reality, and what I'm using in the example on the map is the merge together practices. So it's a very simple command. Look up merge in ArcGIS, dump all the practices you're looking at into it, and you're good to go with the output. However, I couldn't highlight that in that nice little box here. So for illustration purposes, you could pull in a specific type of practice as well and do the same thing. The two tables you need are table BA BMP all and table BA load red. And high level, what you do, we're going to do a selection for that priority resource point again, like we had in previous webinars. I didn't put that here because we've done it a few times already. You're then going to do your join by your unique BMP field. Here, the bang for your buck column isn't already built into the data, so we're actually going to add a field and do that calculation ourselves to build that data in. And I think that was my only slide, so I'm going to exit out of my presentation, bring up my ArcGIS, and I will show you how to do that. So as I begin to show you the live example, I'm just going to point out here real quickly that I am started with a targeted set of practices. So this is not all of the ACPF data. I already applied a filter to this data to narrow it down to a smaller subset that, according to the information we have, should provide a good load reduction benefit. And I'll tell you quickly how I did that, because it's a little different than what Rachel did in the previous webinar. She had sorted by the nitrogen reduction to this outlet, and then selected the top 20, if you guys remember. If you don't, please jump back to that video. You'll get a good demonstration. Rachel did a great job. What I did with all of the merged practices is I went through that same process she did of joining the tables, and I'll give you an example of that in a minute. But then I just ran a simple selection criteria, not select all, that was the wrong button. Select by attributes, and I set up a pretty simple example here that got me down to 55 practices. What I did after I had my tables joined is I said I want anything that gives me at least 10 pounds of nitrogen reduced every year, and at least, one more up, 4 pounds of phosphorus reduced every year. And when I hit apply, as you can see, that gives me the selected set because I already did that, but I applied that to all the practices to get it down to this smaller set. So as we get into the bang for your buck information, like I alluded to at the start, we're already working with a set of practices that should provide pretty good load reductions at the outlet of this resource, or at the outlet of this watershed. And so I'm going to clear that real quick. And to make the viewing easier, the other thing I did, and I'll just orientate you on this as well too, I made these nice little groupings of shape files, so it's just a little easier for us to see. So I'm going to turn off the targeted practices information, and we're going to switch on the economics information. And so here you're seeing the product I had displayed on the map. And now I'm going to break this down and show you how it was built. So as I mentioned, the first thing we need to do is go to table BA load red and make sure we have records selected out of this table that fit for those load reductions at the resource point we're interested in, or the outlet of the watershed. We know from the previous webinars, and I'll tell you today, this is priority resource ID 60. So after I load this in, and what this table has is all the load reductions for all the potential practices to the outlet of the resource point. And so I select for that ID, I hit apply, which I'm not going to do now because the computer will bog down. I've already done this for you. And then I export the selected records. Then I have a data set that I can start to join back to my practices and do the calculations that I'm interested in. And so this is just a little tip from working with this data a lot. If you come in and you do something like this, one of the things I'd encourage you to consider doing, when you save it out, put the priority resource point ID in the name of your file. The reason being, when you come back to this 2 to 3 months later, you'll remember what you did. And so you'll see the label I developed, we were working with this BA load red table. So I put ACPF on the front of it because this is associated with my ACPF practices, not my PTMAP practices. And then I put the name of the table, and then I put the resource ID point we're working on. So when I did that export selected files, I saved it that way so it's a lot easier to get back to. At this point, what I can do is open up my targeted practices list. So we had these targeted practices. I've already done this, but I'm going to show you what it looks like this way. These were the targeted practices. See my 55 records that I described earlier with that little selection I did. And we want to begin adding the fields to the end of the table that we're going to do the calculations for. The ones you would need to add in to do this is a cost column, and then a column for each cost effectiveness calculation you want to do. And these are going to be really simple. Once you get your cost moved over, it is simply your cost divided by the load reduction you're working on, and you're good to go. You've done a cost effectiveness calculation. So again, in this example, I've added several columns, and I'll highlight those real quick. I did my join with the BA load red, and this was done in the previous webinar. Unique BMP ID, you hit OK. And then I kept those R underscore values in here so that I had them. If I go, they should be in here. There they are. So here are underscore values. That way I have those load reductions at the resource point. That was done in the previous webinar. So again, I'm just reviewing that quickly. And then the other thing I need to do to get my BMP total cost, this is one more little trick you have to do. And again, I'm sorry, there's a lot of steps in this one. It's probably the most complicated one, but bear with me and I'll show you how to get all the information you need together. You need to pull in table BA BMP all. So this is your second table you need in this exercise. This is where the cost information is stored. So at the end of this table, so I'm in table BA BMP all, I have my cost field. So you need to pull, for your polygon, you're going to be using two, the BA load red and the table BA BMP all to get the two different sources of information. And so what I can do at that point, coming back to the file I'm working on, we would join using unique BMP ID again. And these are my targeted practices to table BA BMP all, unique BMP ID. And now I can calculate, copy over that total cost field. And so I know this seems like a lot of steps, but once you got this built, you're kind of cooking with Crisco. You're good to go to do your cost effectiveness assessment. And so here are the fields that I had already instructed you on how to add. So the simple thing you do at this point is come in here, add in your cost value. We're now done with all the messy joins, and I apologize, I know that's a lot of steps, but that would be how you make sure you have your load reduction information you need. You have the columns added to do your calculations, and then you also have your cost information. And at this point, what you do is remove all the joins. And so now I have a database built for this group of practices where I have my load reductions at the resource point, I have my cost, and I have my fields that I can begin calculating bang for your buck for. And so in this instance, I'm just going to show you one example for the TN because that's the one we're using. This is the label I came up with because it makes sense to me. You could add this field and name it whatever you want. I always put CE for cost effectiveness, TN because I'm working on total nitrogen in this column. I put the R because it's at the resource point. If I do something with the edge of field, I put a C instead, which you see right here. And then 2-year designates the method behind the scenes for the reduction estimation. And so once I do that, and I've joined all this information back into the table, what I'm able to then do is just do my simple calculation like I described before. And so to get this cost effectiveness calculation, you've gone through the cumbersome steps of joining in and getting all your attributes in here. Then it's just a simple divide your cost by your load reduction column. And my load reductions I know are just a little ways up here in the R values. It'll take me just a minute to scroll to. So here we go. For the nitrogen one, this would be RNQ202 to reflect my label that I had here. If I was working on this phosphorus column, I would do the same calculation, the same process, but instead I would go and grab my phosphorus value. And once you hit on OK on that, which I'm not going to do live here, I don't want to lock up the system. Once you hit OK on that, it'll give you your cost effectiveness values. So now we're at the point where we can develop a map like I have for these 55 practices that shows those that are the most cost effective. Simply for that, you right click and go into properties, go into your symbology and picking that attribute field that you just calculated, and then setting the display to where you like it. I'm not going to muck with this right now because, again, I don't want to lock the system up as things reboot and refresh. But you could do more classes. You could label these how you want and set breakpoints that make sense. So what these data mean, this is the dollar per pound of nitrogen reduced at the outlet of this watershed. And so we're revisiting that again. So the dark purple ones here have a lower dollar invested to reduce a pound of nitrogen than their counterparts in the lighter purple. So the lighter the purple, the more you spend per pound of nitrogen you reduce. And so with that, I'm going to pop back over to my presentation slides. And I know that was kind of a ton of steps to join up the multiple fields. Admittedly, this one is kind of the most complicated with the different data values you got to grab. So I do want to give just a pause point. I'm going to back up a couple of slides here. Any kind of jump in questions at this point before we keep moving through the slide deck?
think it's going well, Drew. I'm having trouble coming up with a specific question, but I think you're on track.
Perfect. Again, with the number of steps there, I'm happy to just keep going. I just wanted to make sure I didn't lose anyone because, as you all know, we're just staring at screens right now. So made it through this. And this is a good pause moment. Was someone trying to get in? I'm sorry, I had just a minute of feedback.
Oh, I was just going to comment there are no questions in the chat box.
All right, thank you, Rob. And again, I can't see those with the way my setup is, so please keep me up to date if anything changes with that. So this is just kind of reinforcing the point I made with the difference between a life cycle cost and the dollars you might use to cost share in something like an implementation program. So as we're putting the materials together, to kind of just point this out, I went and I grabbed the range of EQIP cost share approval for a constructed wetland in 2018 as opposed to 2020. And the purpose of showing this is by no means to say that the data in the Middle Cedar data set doesn't work for what we're showing. I think it absolutely does. With that life cycle cost, it gives you a great planning level assessment of being able to set some reasonable budgets for what implementation might look like. It gives you a great way to set a relative anticipated investment to get a pound of nitrogen reduced. So I'm not trying to dismiss any of that whatsoever. What I'm trying to illustrate here is that you want to continue to be aware that that is a life cycle cost. And if you were to pick this data up and use it for actual guesses at how much you're going to cost share, you might need to tweak your estimates a little bit instead of using a life cycle cost. And the reason being, the life cycle cost, as I mentioned earlier, is inclusive of maintenance and the total cost over the life of that practice that is then divided to give you an annual value. Whereas if you're doing implementation, and I'll just speak with an example of a client we worked with in the past, they were working on an annual work plan, and what they really wanted to know is what funds they needed to ask for to make sure they had enough cost share to implement their practices. And in that instance, they were going to cost share cover crops at, I think it was $16 an acre. I don't know if you remember back, but the life cycle cost assessment is $68 an acre because that's also including things like cost incurred by the farmer and some of the other maintenance things that go on. So you want to, as you dial this information into a specific implementation plan, you want to give some thought to how much you're actually spending in a given year for your conservation programs to use it. Now, this is kind of, for me, when I'm working with this data and working with our clients, to me, this is one of the most interesting pieces you can pull out after you've done this bang for your buck assessment. And this really gets at this idea of a conservation investment guide. So what I showed you in the previous map was the ability to join up these data sets and estimate the bang for your buck for individual practices. And not only just for individual practices, but a selected subset that appeared to be a good starting point for good load reductions within the watershed. Now what we've done though is started to summarize some of the statistics of how cost effective those targeted practices would be. And what that gives you then is it starts to set an expectation for what a good investment may be to reduce nitrogen within this watershed at the outlet of the watershed. And so what I'm showing here for the headwaters watershed, through that exercise I just went through, the average dollar invested to reduce a pound of phosphorus at the outlet was about $142, but it ranged somewhere between $300 and $560. Not surprisingly, the investment in phosphorus is a little bit more expensive. Phosphorus is a little trickier. But what this means then though, you now have a source of information as you consider to implement and cost share practices to look back and say, if we put this in place, is this a good rate of a return from investment perspective in making progress towards those nitrogen and phosphorus goals? And so the way I usually encourage people to look at this is, don't necessarily say, well, we're just going to spend $142 a pound on nitrogen or $30 a pound on nitrogen. Think about it as a range. A good range to invest in this watershed, at least based upon the data and the way we have it set up, is probably somewhere between $30 to $560 per pound of nitrogen reduced at the outlet of the watershed.
So
And I will
Drew,
go ahead, Rob.
just hopping on very quickly. Drew did mention that the cost per source reduction is $68. That data is within the PTMAP data set. And so what we're looking at here is just ACPF data, which is structural. So it does not include those on-field practices within that comparison. So that information is within the data set, but within this assessment, this is just structural practices. So just to highlight that again.
And that's a great interjection, Rob, and thank you for doing that. So backing on a little bit, and Rob, again, I appreciate you doing that. All of these targeting effort exercises we're doing right now are on structural practices. They are not on the field management practices. There is data available here for the field management, but that wasn't used in our webinar for today's purposes or the previous webinar's purposes. We are just focusing on structural practices from ACPF. Thank you, Rob. Any other kind of comments, questions at this point? I'll show you quickly in ArcGIS how I pulled out these ranges, and then I'll move on to the next example. So in our initial exercise in the live demo, we went through the process of joining all these tables together, doing the calculations. But as I said, now that you've gone through all the work, you got a really nice set of information that you can begin to build these products off of. The map I just shown you, and also the table I was just describing. So a couple of ways you can do it. Simple way is to just right click on the column where we had divided our cost by the load reduction to get our bang for our buck estimate, and look at the statistics. So you're seeing some of the information that I have in the table. The averages, and then differencing the min and the max gives me my range, the top and the bottom end. And if you don't like messing around in ArcGIS, and I'll fully admit I'm very comfortable in ArcGIS, so I don't mind doing it all, but we have a lot of team members even in our own company when they hit this stage that instead of trying to mess around with the statistics in here, they'll pop over and just simply save out the database somewhere on their computer. So I'll slow that down 1 minute. Again, if you are much more comfortable in Excel, you get this database built. It's a very easy operation to click on this little drop-down area, go to export, pop that open, navigate to where you want to have it on your computer. And what I always use is I save it as a DBF file. There's other options there, but from my experience, once you save it out as a DBF, it's very easy then to import into Excel, save as a standard Excel document, and now it's much easier then for you to potentially, if you're more comfortable in Excel, work through that data and generate some of the statistics and information about it. So just another little tip or trick there. So again, building that table, all I did was simply grab the statistics from my various cost effectiveness columns. I'm going to pop back over to my PowerPoint slides. I'm going to make it big again so it's a little easier to see. We'll move forward to the next example. So the two products I've shown you with the return on investment or the cost effectiveness data so far is the initial map that shows variations in how cost effective the different practices are. And then I showed you the table where you could pull out information to kind of develop an investment guide. This next product would be thinking about it kind of like Rachel did, where you're selecting the best of what you have. So in the previous webinar, what was done is we merged all the practices together, we did some table joins, and then we selected out the top 20 practices based upon load reduction. Where we're at now going into the product that I'm showing on this screen, we have narrowed down the data set to 55 practices, all of which are predicted to give us a good load reduction potential. We've attached the cost effectiveness information, and because I have that attached, now I could go through that top 20 exercise again, but instead of just selecting the best 20 for load reductions, I'm selecting the best 20 that have a high load reduction potential and are the most cost-effective BMPs within that watershed for reducing load at the outlet of the watershed. And so what that looks like, really simple at this point, like I said, we went through all the hard work of joining our tables already, creating the new attributes, moving the fields over and doing the calculations. All that I just demonstrated previously. Now when I pop into the database, it's a simple sort and select. So pretty handy. And in the example that I'm going to jump into, I'll do it two ways. The CAN thing that I'd done previously to develop this map, is I ran a select by attributes command, assuming that 80 pounds per acre per year is a really good cost effectiveness number. So anything less than that's great. And then I'll also go back and show you how you can do this sort and select your top 20. So I'm going to zoom forward just a little bit here in my presentation. I'm going to exit out of this, and I'm going to go to my live demo. So as I mentioned, what I had shown on the map initially is this idea that you could do a select by attribute. So there's a couple ways to do this. If you know you don't want to spend more than, let's say it's in this instance, 80 bucks per pound of nitrogen you reduce, you can simply come in here, pick your cost effectiveness value you're working on, and do a little selection statement. Like I said, 80 bucks a ton. So what I'm showing on the map now are the practices just for the headwaters watershed, where they're predicted to reduce nitrogen at a pretty cost-effective rate, less than 80 bucks per ton at the outlet of the sub-watershed. And for structural practices, from my experience, that's pretty good. The other way of doing it, and this would be more similar to the selection method Rachel used in her targeting presentation or webinar 2, we could come over here. Right now I got 21 practices selected, so I was pretty close to that 20 mark already. But instead of sorting descending, because we want the lower values, we're going to sort ascending. And if I'm staying honest to the number of 20, I would not select that last one on the list, so I would end up closer to 60 bucks per ton of phosphorus. So the top 20 in this instance, if I, and this is why you don't want to do live demonstrations. Now the selection thing isn't liking me. Got it, perfect. Now I have the top 20 selected, and they're starting at about 30 bucks a pound per phosphorus, and we're ending up at about 60 bucks per pound of phosphorus. And again, very similar. So two ways you can select out the data. And so I'm going to make a pretty big transition here in the slides. I'm going to move from working with the water quality load reduction information, and I'm going to twist things a little bit and start to bring in multi-benefits. And so I'm going to be shifting into very similar concepts for bang for your buck, but instead of just looking at nutrient reductions, we're going to start to look at some of these data and how they could help you with starting discussions around reducing water quantity. So before I make that transition, I do want to do one more quick pause and just give folks a chance for questions if they have any. I do plan to have time at the end as well too, just as a heads up for everyone. But before we make that transition, anyone want to jump on with any questions? All right, I'm going to keep moving then. Feel free to jump in and interrupt if you think of something in the meantime. And as I mentioned, I'll make this big again. Now I'm going to start transitioning and show you some of the information that's already ingrained in both ACPF and PTM app that could help start some of those discussions around water quantity. I want to be very fair as I start into this section. I am not presenting a hydrologic model. So this by no means takes the place of some of the hydrologic modeling that's been done within the region, in the state, and even in this area. What I would say is there is already some data embedded in PTM app and ACPF that would allow you to start to explore what practices might make sense to consider for hydrologic modeling in the future. Because ingrained in this already is NRCS curve number theory and some very simple leg time flow routing. And I know that's a lot of words and a lot of acronyms if you're not familiar with NRCS curve number theory. But in general, it's a pretty common engineering approach to looking at volumes and peak discharge for different storm events. And we already have a lot of that ingrained in here. And also inside of ACPF, especially for some of the structural practices, the ACPF toolbar does a very nice job of attaching estimates of how much storage potential there could be in some of those structural practices. So it gives a very interesting place to start at least looking at the data you have available and begin to exploring it for multiple benefits. And what I mean by that, we've already showed all the water quality stuff. And again, now we're starting to add in some information about water quantity. And so what I have displayed in the map, and again, I'm going to break this down for you and then we'll jump over to live example of how to build this. I have the nutrient reduction wetlands added in now, and that's an ACPF output. And I'm displaying them with one variable that's already attached to that data, or one attribute, one field, whatever the jargon is you like to use to refer to those. So I brought in my nutrient reduction wetlands from ACPF, and I displayed them with this attribute here, VAR STOR acre feet. And what that is it's a rough estimate of the live storage capacity within that practice. And so all I did is symbolize them to show those nutrient reduction wetlands that have, at least compared to the other ones within that watershed, the highest potential for live storage. So in other words, they're the biggest container that might be able to store some water for you. So that's the ACPF data I brought in. The next piece of information I brought in was from PTMap. And what's buried in PTMap, and this is actually, it doesn't get used a lot because it's something that is inside of the data to help drive the water quality calculations. But to drive the water quality calculations, we've built in there estimates of peak discharge, excess depth, and volume of runoff for 2-year 24-hour storm events and 10-year 24-hour storm events. And so I'll show you in a very simple manner how you can kind of join that current discharge information up, overlay it with your live storage information, and begin to get a sense of where do I got a lot of peak discharge coming off the landscape, and where do I got opportunities to store it. And again, as I'm sure many of you know who work in this world, this isn't a full hydrology assessment, or hydrologic assessment. It doesn't take the place of that. But I think given that this data is available, it's a good starting point to begin to think about what multi-benefits might look like for a practice. So I kind of overviewed this a little bit while I was talking about the product. But what we're using is the NRW file from the ACPF output. The other thing that I'll be showing inside of here, and I'm suggesting, is considering the drainage area. I did not have that on my map, but when I go to my live example, I'll show that and I'll explain why I'm suggesting that. And then what I don't have shown on this, maybe it's the next slide. There's the drainage areas. All right, it's popping up. We got some fun animations. There is also, I apologize, I didn't get that one highlighted. I'll show this when I go to the live demo, but there is also 2 PTMap files you need to add in. And these are from the previous examples. That's probably why I didn't stick the highlighted circle in here. It is the catchment shapefile, and it is table_catchment. And when I get over to my live example here, I'll point out where that stuff is. So we're going to turn off our economics data now because we're done with that section. I'm going to collapse that down. And if you guys have never built these, I'll just give you a little tip. I thought this was a lot easier for presenting myself. So you can bury these files underneath a label, and it allows you to kind of turn and categorize data and turn them off. Some of you guys familiar with GIS might already know that. Kaya, who's one of our GIS whizzes in the office, is probably laughing on silent right now that I'm showing some of this stuff like, everyone knows that, but that's okay. We're going to switch over to the quantity information. So I got 2 sets of data buried in here, as I mentioned. I got the ROI information, which I've already built. We're going to get to that example next. But the first thing we're touching on are opportunities for a lot of storage. And so the first thing I'll show you is the NRW file and what I did. So I simply added in from the ACPF output that nutrient reduction wetland polygon, went to properties, and I went to quantities, graduated color, and I symbolized it based upon that VAR store AF. So again, these values in here are showing potential acre feet of live storage. And this is from the ACPF output. We then categorize them from low to high. And so you get a map that shows you, wanted to reload, in dark purple, where the opportunities are for the highest amount of storage. Then underlaying that, I'm pairing it together with my PTM app information. So I also have some knowledge about where most of the discharge is coming from for a 2-year 24-hour event or a 10-year 24-hour event. In this instance, I'm displaying the 10-year 24-hour event. And so the table I added in again, I'll jump over to show you that one. This is my catchment file that has the discharge information attached to it. And then this right here, table catchment, is the table I added in from the PTM app output data set. So this table catchment, and this was used in previous webinars, I'm pretty sure, has a lot of the information associated with load delivery, so how much sediment, nitrogen, phosphorus gets delivered places. But it also has some information from NRCS curve number theory. The excess depth for the storm event, the runoff volume for that storm event, and the peak discharge for that storm event. So in order to make my map for that, it's a fairly simple join. So this is my catchment file. I've already changed the label just so it's easier to understand what's being shown. So this is my catchment from PTM app. They're average 40 acres in size. Like I said, have been used in some of the other webinars. I'm simply going to join this by catchment ID to table catchment. When I hit OK on that, I now have my attributes joined to this field so that I can do my mapping, and I can map by these peak flows. So to get the display the way I have it set, you're simply going to properties again, going to quantities, graduated colors under the symbology tab, and doing peak Q for 10-year 24-hour event. This is where I could also switch over to a 2-year. If you're more interested in volume as opposed to peak runoff, you could switch to the volume calculations. Or I know some of the engineers I work with, they really talk a lot about how much depth you're going to target or store. The excess depth information for NRCS curve number method is also in here. So that's, in my opinion, when you're starting to talk about hydrology, some pretty good basic information to get you started with those quantity discussions. The other thing for my maps, and I hadn't said this yet, if they look a little see-through, it's because I guess I got a little cute with how I did the mapping here. You guys probably know this. Again, guys are going to be laughing at me. Just so it looked a little crisper in my mind, I adjusted the transparency on the layers. So you'll see if I drop down to my quantity section and I go into my peak discharge layer, and this is a toolbar you can add in called effects. It's thinking really hard. Effects. I can adjust the transparency of that layer. And it, for me, when I'm doing this, it makes things pop out a little more, a little easier to see. And with that, I think I'm good to go back to my presentation slide deck. And so I'm not going to make this big again because it's just this one slide. The next step we're going to go into is doing that same return on investment calculation. So we did it for the nutrients. I figured we might as well do it for the potential to store water as well too. So what I'll be calculating in just a minute here is an estimate of the dollar investment to add an acre foot of live storage. So that's another thing with the data that's here between all these different systems that could be calculated. And what we're working on top of, in this instance, we got a lot of information here, but we're doing from the ACPF output, we need our nutrient reduction wetlands. The reason this looks a little confusing is we're adding a level of detail now. So this is the core ACPF outputs that I'm sure most of you are familiar with. These are the outputs again after it's been run through IAPA or ingested by PTM app. So now we have some of the benefits attached to it. So the reason we need this, again, we're going to go to this table BA BMP all and get our cost information. Because we already have this storage data packed into ACPF, we're joining back with this to get the cost data, doing a very simple calculation, and we're good to go to look at return on investment. So I'll show you that real quick. In my earlier example, I had already shown you where table BA BMP all is. So all you do is simply go up here. Well, that's the wrong one. That's for 61. It's going to throw us a curveball. This is the one for priority resource 60, the upper watershed. Do a join between your nutrient reduction wetlands from ACPF with a unique BMP ID again. And then we're going to go to that table BA BMP all from the ACPF IAPA data. and join that up with unique BMP. You'd hit OK. Not going to do that here because I don't want to bog down the system. You'd come in here. Whoop. Scroll to the right. You'd add your field BMP total cost, which I'm not going to do. And I think I actually have that stored a little further left here because this data is already joined. Bear with me 1 minute while I circle back over there. So here's the field I added previously. And then you'd simply do your field calculator again on top of that to transfer from table BA BMP all that cost data into your ACPF IAPA output information. At that point, I would always remove my join. Just see if I need to do that. I already did that in advance of the webinar. And now we're at the point where we can begin to calculate ROI for the flow reductions. And I think the reason I'm not seeing some of my pre-generated data is I haven't turned that one on yet. So I was still looking at the live storage information when I opened that up. Now I will turn on the information that's showing return on investment. So again, we got to flip our thinking a little bit here. For live storage, we wanted dark purple, a lot of storage, at least in theory, that's what you'd want. For return on investment, we're flipping the script. Again, we want lower values. We want to spend less money to add an acre foot of storage to the landscape. And so when I open this attribute, we should see some of those values within here. Just have to scroll to the right. So I had added the BMP total cost. And again, we don't have the return on investment file. So we got to add one more field now that our cost data is in here. I name mine cost effectiveness, acre feet. Name it what you want, whatever you remember. So if you're going to do this, it would look something like CE acre feet, if you like the way I did it. Another tip when I do this, by default, it's short integer. When I do my calculations, I always use a float. I don't know, I spent way too much time in research and I built way too many databases where stuff got screwed up. And for me, float always works the best. Personal preference. So you hit OK on that, your attribute gets added in. And now you're back to that simple return on investment calculation where you right-click on cost effectiveness, go to field calculator, and then it's that simple division again of the BMP total cost, which is about midway through my data. Take me just a minute to track it down here. Again, these databases are big. Sometimes they take a little while to sort through, but I do want to show you the calculation. There it went. BMP total cost divided by that volume of live storage, that VAR store AF. I hit OK on that. And what I get to see here now is the dollar per acre foot of storage reduced. And so as you can see, for this data, we're somewhere between $1,000 and about $1,400 per acre foot of storage in this watershed for a nutrient reduction wetland. And so with that, I'm going to pop back over to my slides. And I'm going to pause before I talk about this table again. I'm just doing these little pauses. We're just about done with the content for today, so we're right on schedule to have a discussion period here at the end. I got one more table to explain. Kai is going to give an overview. That we're going to be at our question period. But before we transition again, just another quick pause. Anyone got any questions, comments? All right, hearing none quickly at least. If you got some, feel free to interrupt. Otherwise, I'm going to move on to this next thing. So I've grabbed from our previous discussion this investment guide data for nitrogen reduction and phosphorus reduction that I'd built into the table previously. We spent some time talking about this. And now what I have added in though, I showed you that our live storage was between about $1,000 to $1,400 per acre foot. I've added in that information as well too. So really at this point, once you've generated this kind of information, you got an investment guide for considering multi-benefits. If a practice comes in, you got the data at your fingertips that you're considering putting in. You have data at your fingertips once you've assessed that individual practice to consider how it fits within the context of return on investment for both nutrients and live storage. Not included in here is sediment. We could have added that in. We didn't use that for any of our demonstrations. But at least in this instance, we've built it for nutrient improvements, as well as storage to alleviate excess water. And so that was my last content slide. I think we're making decent time here. And Kaya, if you would like to come on mute, I've stolen a slide from what she's going to be showing on Monday in our 4th webinar. And if you could kind of just give a brief overview of what's coming in our 4th and final webinar, I'd be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, so thanks, Drew. Basically, what the next webinar is going to be is taking all the data that we have learned how to pull out of PTMAP, ACPF, and the IAPA, is to then how do we present this, to local farm owners or to other landowners and, get their attention and cooperation. So one of the things we're going to really go through is how can we make a series of maps to display certain qualities of data to, get their engagement and really work with them. So basically go through a bunch of the steps of just how to kind of organize that data to best function and make sense to, the everyday person that isn't working with GIS every day. So that's kind of the basics of it. And yeah, I'll look forward to seeing you guys next week.
Thank you very much, Kai, and thanks for that overview. Yeah, I think the 4th and final webinar is going to be a great way to close out. So much of what we've shown you today, I mean, I categorize it as kind of planning data and data that you can use internally to help focus and inform decisions on when, where, and how you're going to invest in conservation. What Kai is going to be showing and what she did a great job of explaining is kind of taking it to that final step of how do we package it, use it with the landowners, and engage in a discussion about opportunities. So, as mentioned, the next webinar that you guys have coming is outreach to landowners. And as is alluded to here with high ROI potential, I think I'm starting to lose my ability to talk. With high ROI potential, a lot of what Kyle will show you will integrate the information from the previous webinars. So you'll see real practical examples of how to take these maps and products we've shown you and boil them down into products that can be used for engaging landowners. We also, just to kind of be, explain how we've seen this used. One of the things that our clients typically do with this type of information when it's all packaged together, and I alluded to this in the Q&A in the previous section, after they get this information packaged so they can share it with landowners, what we've seen clients do is they'll send out direct mailings to landowners or make the direct contact when they zoom in on a place where they know they want to put a practice based upon the information contained here and their own local information on the types of practices and locations they think they should be built. So they'll use that as a way to really engage the landowner directly. But then on the back end, they'll set up programs that make use of the data and say, well, in addition to those targeted areas, I want to be ready for that landowner who walks through the door, has a project they know they want to do, and have a way to gauge against this data if it's a good idea to build that project with the resources we have through conservation programs. So what they'll do is they'll identify critical areas of loss, and it's kind of a two-pronged thing. We're going to directly engage to try to get some practices built, but at the same time, we're identifying those critical areas on the landscape that if a farmer comes through the door and they have a critical area on their field, we know we want to get out there and do some conservation. So reminder, I know we've hit on this a few times, we are going to make this presentation and the video available to everyone on the line. And with that, we've made it all the way through our content for today. So the next slide is going to be transition to questions. And Jim, if you want to jump on first for any closing thoughts, I'd greatly appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Drew. That was a great summary of accessing some of the economic information available in the tool, and appreciate that very much. I know it's kind of heavy going to track through all that, but hopefully having the video available for folks to look through at their leisure if they want to dig into the details and start looking at some of the cost information in here. Hopefully that'll be a great reference. Any thoughts or comments from those on the line here in terms of thinking about return on investment and costs and prioritizing outreach, or using the data? Just any thoughts from folks?
So as Drew mentioned, I mean, there's a lot in there. So I mean, it's really approaching it from a. I think Jeff asked this question as opposed to last webinar. What are some of the potential riders for the data? And Drew, thank you for going over that data today. Don't forget that ACPF does have a good bit of information, just independent of PTMAP, that when joined together can really speed up some of that basin-wide assessment information.
So if anyone has a question, talk over the top of me. I'd rather answer your questions, but I kind of, does anyone in the group have an idea they could offer up on opportunities they see locally to kind of package together this information and start to use it? If not, that's fine, but.
This is James. We have a number of watershed projects in Southeast Iowa that have utilized ACPF. We're currently working on it. So it's just kind of a matter of kind of figuring out in terms of workload, who might be a good candidate to partner with in those district offices to try this out. Kind of what I'm thinking, maybe try it out on a Huck 12. See how it goes. One of the questions I can think I'd get from like a commissioner or somebody when looking at some of the load information is, how confident are we in some of that? And I was just kind of wondering, listening, if you guys have done any case studies or paired any water monitoring data with some of these points to kind of validate some of that.
Great question. And the short answer is yes. We could probably dig out a little tech memo where what we did is we compared the base loading to a Discovery Farms program, so edge of field monitoring for a farm, small watershed monitoring, and large watershed monitoring. And so we did kind of a 3-scale comparison. I would encourage everyone, if they start using this, to do a gut check with their understanding of the loading in their own watershed to make sure, to your point, and this is why I say it that way, in general, I think the numbers come out pretty reasonable, but no one wants to be the person that stands up, puts a slide on the wall, and have someone in the room and say, those are 10 times higher than we're used to seeing here. What are you talking about? So when we did that comparison, the numbers were reasonable, but I think it is absolutely good practice to gut check them for your own watersheds. The final point of that, the final thing I'll say there, if you pick these up for a small watershed and the numbers are a little off, there are features built into these systems where you can either scale all the information to match one monitoring point, or if you're in a watershed where there's been a SWOT model done, or APEX, or any of the other water quality monitoring acronyms out there, there are systems in place where you can scale the information, the loading information, to fit those calibrated water quality models as well too. So summarize that real quick. In general, we've seen pretty good matches with monitoring data. Encourage you, if you use it, to check within your own watershed if it's matching what you're seeing. And if things are way off, there's opportunities to scale it to fit what you're seeing.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, I would just add to that, Drew. I mean, a lot of this data is based off the inputs that are coming in too. So a lot of it is land use data. That is the National Land Cover Units, which is a 30 by 30 meter grid. So it's very averaged out in that respect, not down to a really small, farm scale or something, it's very wide based. So that tends to have a skew just because it is such a larger data set of a 30 by 30, and then you're looking at a smaller cell. So that can have impacts. And we have seen that if you have a better land use data set for a smaller area that does have an impact on your results coming out of that too. So something else to consider is the inputs going in, size and scale of those inputs.
Hey, Drew, back to your question about the where, some of this data might be applied. So unfortunately, we're in between watershed coordinators and Blackhawk Creek right now, but those 3 Huck 10s there, I think that has a lot of potential. Shane or Mary Beth, perhaps you might chime in. You have a lot of experience elsewhere in the Middle Cedar. You've got some established projects where there's been traction, places like Miller Creek, the Benton Tama project, and now there's a fairly nascent effort to influence adjacent Huck 12s through what's being called diffusion hubs. I was thinking either those kind of anchor projects that go back about 5 years, or those new Huck 12s through the diffusion hubs. Those might be really ripe opportunities to apply these.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, particularly, my experience, many of you know, was in Miller Creek and within the Middle Cedar. And as part of a EPA Gulf of Mexico project, we're completing a couple of wetland projects there. So I think there could be some really cool opportunities to kind of compare, and there's monitoring components to those programs as well. So it may be that opportunity locally where we could kind of compare outputs from, this GIS modeling compared to some real life numbers. And, there's a concentration of bioreactor saturated buffers. I know working with James on some of these things, there's the ACPF, I really appreciate a lot. There's a lot of, particularly with that saturated buffers, bioreactors, additional criteria that's challenging, particularly in like surface intakes and things like that, which will knock out sites. And that was kind of one of my questions too, is, if a coordinator was to use something like this, if once you get a few years in a watershed, you start to understand it pretty well. You can, I guess that would be my question, is how easy it would be to incorporate practices there as they're put on the ground, and as you knock out, like maybe ACPF says, yeah, this looks like it's going to be good. You go out there and evaluate it and find out that that's not the case. So I don't know what your thoughts on that are, Drew, or if you have any comments there, but I was just, it's kind of one of the things I've been thinking about.
I think that was a great comment and a great question. So we did take the existing data practices data set as part of this project and evaluate it for the benefits. And what I'd say, if you continue to put polygons into that data set consistent with its structure, you could easily, because you have the investment in the underlying data, hit a few buttons and get it to rerun and generate your benefits for comparison. The other thing, and you're spot on, this is a GIS exercise. It provides useful information, but that local knowledge is critical to continuing to maintain the data. And so if you have someone who has moderate GIS expertise in your group, I think they could readily go in and delete out some of those files that aren't pertinent or flag them, and then they're very easy to pull out of the system. We never present it because I don't think this data set is quite, or this system is quite mature enough yet for this to have been used. For that question you asked, we actually have an erase function built into PTMap that'll literally wipe the data out based upon a polygon. Cool. The nonprofit we were working with when we built that said it should be a landowner orneriness index. Like the places you're never going to work, and of course we're not going to put that into it, something like that. But but to your point, if there's already enough work done there, or you're not going to do work, there's opportunities to easily modify the information.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
I apologize. I've been sort of jumping on and off the webinar, just have something else going on right now. But just definitely want to thank you for this. As far as some potential applications, I think that's where you were going with your question. We are kind of looking at our next, our CPP application. Sean knows this and Jim knows this. And one of the kind of strategies we've been thinking about is working with some of these source water impacted communities in the Middle Cedar. And lately, we've been asked to do an exercise of selecting priority Huck 12s for source water protection in the Middle Cedar. We have a number selected and are making some recommendations to DNR based on that. And it could be a possible angle to do some of this analysis in those Huck 12s that drain to kind of source water impaired communities, and look at what types of practices might be a good fit for nitrate reduction, specifically in the kind of groundwater protection areas that we already, for the most part, have mapped. So I think that's another application, something to be thinking about, and maybe could have some pretty short-term usage here as we get going with an application. So just something to throw out there.
Great comment. And just as an added layer, I don't think this will get presented here. There is an analysis that can be done right on top of this information that will identify risk of infiltration. And it's just using the simple, basically the curve number stuff. So if you're in a source water area that's stream fed, you already got that data. If it's groundwater system, you can start to identify, if I put a practice, do those benefits accrue to the groundwater or to the surface water? Full transparency, it does not do like mod flow calculations all the way down. That's super complicated, but it does at least give you an idea, will that practice give me benefits to the groundwater or the surface water?
So I'm wondering whether there might be other tools like, coming from the Iowa Flood Center that might, be more specific about that. I know they were working on sort of surface water, groundwater interactions and geomorphology, and I believe it's called the GHOST model, where they have that done for the Middle Cedar. I'm wondering if, obviously we can't look at this IAPA tool in a vacuum. We have to look at what other tools are available, allocate scale watershed plans, GHOST model, things like that. But I wonder if, as part of the follow-up work that Drew put a teaser out there previously, that could be part of it. It might not be only applying the IAPA on a particular Huck 12 with source water, but also looking at what other tools are out there, and how can these practitioners, take the best from a, menu of tools or number of different tools and apply that, say to that particular source water protection need. That could be an interesting feature of the follow-up work if Houston's amenable to that.
Yeah, we'd be very flexible on that. So whatever the group would be interested in, we'd support in whatever way we could, or flat out tell you, we don't know how to do that stuff, so we won't be very helpful. But so far to the discussion, yeah, I think no problem.
Any other comments or questions from anyone? Just have a couple minutes left. Just remind folks, we have the final fourth webinar on Monday at 10 o'clock. Kyle will be sharing on using some of this information to develop farm and field specific outreach information, and that should be really good. Looking forward to that part as well to kind of wrap things up. And thanks everyone for taking time to join us here today, and we'll get this recorded and documented or filed so people can access it and review later if they'd like to. But again, have a great weekend. Thanks for joining. Thanks, Drew, and thanks, Kaya.
Thank you much.